My guest today is Marissa Palmer, who is the co-founder, along with her husband Brandon, of Acton Academy Madison West in Madison, Wisconsin. Marissa is a former investment banker and hedge fund analyst who spent the last decade building education businesses and also teaching at the higher education level and beyond. Brandon's background is in IT, and when the couple heard about the Acton Academy educational model, they decided to bring one of these programs to their community. I've profiled many Acton Academy founders on my podcast over the past couple of years. I love to spotlight the learner-driven model of Acton that now includes over 300 schools around the world, serving thousands of learners. So, Marissa Palmer, welcome to the LiberatED podcast.
Thanks, Kerry. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. I want to talk all about the launch of Acton Academy Madison West, which you launched in January of 2023. So I guess about 18 months into this, you now have 15 heroes, is what we call your learners. So tremendous growth from your introduction to the school back in 2023 with only 4 learners. So it's great to hear that this model is resonating in your community, and I want to hear all about that. But I'd love to start, if we could, Marissa, with a little bit of your background, because I think it's fascinating to hear how you went from investment banking, hedge fund manager. You have MBA from Columbia Business School, to school founder. Tell us about how that happened.
Sure. I like to say I borrowed a phrase from one of my old bosses, which is I'm a reformed investment banker. So when I was in investment banking and working at a hedge fund, when I looked at my portfolio manager, managing directors, I didn't really feel like I wanted to be them when I verbally grew up. But I did really enjoy working with the management teams of the portfolio companies. And I really admired the CEOs that I worked with. They were strong operators, very bright, but, really had to be multifaceted. So I thought they were fascinating people. And I thought I would really like to try my hand at running a business. So I ended up from the hedge fund, I knew I also wanted to work more with people. So I had started career coaching with Columbia MBAs as part of an alumni program they had. And I loved that. So when an opportunity to run the Americas division of a British-based training company came along, I was a little on the fence about the teaching part. Like that was new to me, but I wanted the P&L responsibility. So I took the leap. And I loved it. And I fell in love with teaching. We would run these training programs they were large. So you might have anywhere from 150 to 200 recent graduates, investment banking analysts. And these would run 8 hours a day for 4 to 6 weeks at a time. So they were very high energy. I couldn't lecture for more than 10 minutes before they needed to be in an activity, right, to keep them awake. So I really developed an appreciation for activity-based learning and learning by doing. So that was a lot of fun. After that, I wanted to stay in this kind of financial services education space. So I helped build GLG University, which was part of a research platform at Garrison Lehrman Group in New York. And then, my husband and I had our son, and we decided, we wanted to raise him in the Midwest. We thought they were pretty solid Midwestern values. So we moved to Madison, and I started working part-time and kind of edged in full-time to teaching investment banking and securities analysis at UW, University of Wisconsin. And it was a lot of fun, like coming from the corporate training world. My classes were very practical. They were learning the things that they would need to do as investment bankers. So these classes became really popular because the students would say, "Oh, I was so prepared for my interview," or "I was so well prepared for my internship." And then I also created an online financial modeling class, which was one of the first badge programs at UW. So that was a little bit about, how I got here, and that's where we were when we stumbled upon Acton.
Yeah, and so what was happening before you stumbled upon Acton? I know you have your son is currently enrolled in the program. What was education like for him before Acton,
Mhm.
and what kind of led you to this new model?
Sure. So he had gone to a play-based preschool and was really happy, just very curious, loved going to school. But then we shifted to kindergarten and we went to one of the local districts here. I mean, it's actually one of the best districts in the state. But he was coming home like just miserable and exhausted. So he was 5 years old. He was coming home with like stacks of worksheets, which I knew for him would be challenging because he loves to build. Um, yeah, he loves building. He loves hands-on learning, right? Children at that age are learning through their senses. Um, I did after a couple of weeks when he was still coming home saying he hated school. I called up his teacher and, she said to me that he was tantruming anywhere from 10 to 15 times a day. And part of it is the frequent transitions, right? So every 20 to 30 minutes, the expectation was that he would be shifting subject matter. And he was definitely a child who, if he was into something, could focus intensely for extended periods of time. So I think those frequent transitions, being tied to a desk, like he wanted to move around. Yeah, it was just really hard on him. And my number one goal was for him to love going to school. Yeah, so from there we shifted him to another private school, right? Like it was more the college prep track, like K through 12 school. And it was definitely better. It was smaller. It was a really nice community. One difference that I think he really liked were there were science specials, which there weren't at the public school. I remember asking him, when he was going to our public school, like, "What are you doing for science?" Right? Because he's very science and engineering oriented. And he said, "Well, I watch animals on my iPad." And I thought, what a missed opportunity for hands-on learning and exploring the natural and physical world. So that was one thing we really appreciated about the second school he was at. But even after a year, he was still coming home saying that he hated math and he hated reading. And those are pretty fundamental. So we stumbled upon a podcast about Acton Academy. And it was actually my husband that found it. And it just really resonated with both of us, where we actually quipped, like, that seems more like the workplaces we were in New York than school. Because, I've never had a boss who said to me, "Okay, go learn this information, and then I want you to take a test. And if you get an A, you're promoted," right? Like, I've had bosses who say, "Here's a problem I have. Help me solve it," right? And that's how you're successful. So we really saw Acton as, helping facilitate our child becoming a problem solver.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that you talked about working with MBA students and college students and realizing that they could only really focus on a lecture for a few minutes before wanting to get into, project-based learning. And then there's sort of this disconnect in, what we're expecting kindergartners and elementary school students to do, which is really a much heavier lift in a lot of ways than I think what you said you saw in adult learners. So interesting to kind of bring those two pieces together. I wonder what happened next from that podcast moment to launch.
Yeah. So, it was interesting because I think my husband's been on his own journey throughout this as well. Because when we were first talking about where to send our son to kindergarten, he was very much pro public school. He thought I was like a little silly because since my son had been born, I had been reading books on like education and boys and schooling and how it had changed since like 40 years since I was in kindergarten. So it was interesting that he brought that podcast to me, because I think his eyes were being opened as well by our son's experience. And yeah, so I actually Googled Acton from the podcast and I saw you could start a school. And I thought, all right, I have this education experience. Like I haven't done it at this age group, but I think I could do this. And he was a serial kind of tech startup guy. So I said to him, like, do you want to start a school? And I was so shocked that he said yes. Um, so that was it. So we ended up applying, um, and it went pretty quickly from there. It was, I guess, December 2022. Um, so it took us a full year to launch, but that was when we were approved for the Acton license. And, we kind of sat on it for a little bit. Like we went through the orientation, um, and then just kind of sat on it. And I had this, thought in the back of my mind, like, is this just going to be another thing that I think is really neat and I end up never doing anything with, right? Did we just buy this license and I'm going to do nothing, or am I going to do this? Um, so we decided, he's like, well, why don't we start looking for a location? So that was kind of the first step. And that was when I think it started getting really real. So in April, we were pretty fortunate. There was a daycare near us that was for sale, like the building was for sale. And that actually didn't work out. It wasn't like, um, it wasn't ADA compliant. There were all kinds of like massive investments that would have needed to be made. But it did connect us with a real estate broker who helped us find a really great space in a church. So we've been renting at one of the churches in Madison. So there were some remediations that needed to be done in the space. So between April, we probably found this space in April or May, and we weren't able to open until that December. And then, in the meantime, I had a handful of parents who had actually reached out to us while we were in our starting up phase because they knew the Acton Academy brand, and Acton Academy on their website says, okay, one coming in Madison. And so I did talk to one family that was really excited about the Acton Academy model. So I kept, for 9 months, talking with them and saying, we're opening, we're opening. Then once we kind of had the space, um, kind of at a reasonable place, that November, we had hosted an open house. And I feel like there was definitely some pent up demand because one family joined us from that open house for that kind of pilot, you know, period. And then we had another family who signed up for kindergarten for the year before. And then we've had some siblings join us and some additional families. So that was really the start of the adventure.
And you've almost quadrupled in size
Yeah.
in this year and a half, now up to 15 students. So Marissa, did you quit your job to do this full time? Are you doing projects on the side? I guess how does this work for you as a school founder?
Yeah, so I did, I think I kind of reduced my teaching load up until up until we actually launched. Yeah, I'm trying to think if I taught another semester after that, but I think once we launched, I quit, and I am not taking a salary. So my husband's, his W-2 is very important for, kind of like keeping our family afloat. Um, but yeah, so now I'm full-time Acton. We did hire a guide initially. I think that's also been a challenge is, going into this, I did very much feel like the blind leading the blind, right? I think through this process as an entrepreneur, I am getting the stark reality at times of what I'm good at and what I'm not. Um, So that has been challenging. I'd also say just there's time, like as an owner, right? You're starting the business. So that there was also a lot I really needed to learn about the nitty gritty of the Acton philosophy. And so now I feel like as I know Acton better, I have a much better sense of what to look for in guides and like what the right mindset is. What are the questions I really should be asking? So we felt like our first guide didn't work out as well as we would have liked. So I stepped into the studio and we hired another guide. So she and I kind of split time. And she was really critical at getting our Spark studio, which is the younger studio, off the ground. But I think in the end, yeah, so it's taken some time to get the right guide team in place. Now we have two guides who I feel really great about. I think they have really the mindset of letting children lead. And I think as an adult, that's one of the hardest parts is letting go and seeing the beauty in what sometimes from the outside seems really messy when you have, 15 children who are kind of finding their way, but like they're learning so much through these interactions and processes. So anyway, long story short, I think one of the biggest challenges is like finding adults that are truly willing to let go and step back.
Yeah, I want to talk more about the educational philosophy of Acton and kind of learner-driven education. But just one more sort of structural question as you were launching. I know some of the Acton Academy founders I've spoken to run their programs as sort of homeschool collaboratives because of various state laws. Others will become, state recognized private schools, doing the same thing, but just sort of different structures depending on, state and local regulations that enable them to have that flexibility around the learning model. How does that work for you?
hmm So in Wisconsin, like with homeschooling, the homeschooling actually has to be between a parent and a child. And so there isn't really the opportunity for like a homeschooling co-op. Also, homeschoolers are able to take courses at a public school, but if they were to come to our school, it would be more considered an enrichment program. I mean, ultimately, I think the families decide how they're going to report their minimum hours. Um, but I think from what I understand, completely by the book, they couldn't attend our school, be homeschoolers, and actually count that towards their 875 annual schooling hours, which is sort of interesting. So we are a private school, which as a founder, I mean, I will say that that was very simple to get started. I felt like the regulations were very friendly. The hardest part was like zoning and building codes. Um, yeah, that was the biggest hurdle, just making sure the real estate was up to code. But after that, you can start a private school. You have to fill in a survey and register with the Department of Public Instruction. And we have to, promise to provide a breadth of curriculum and a progressive curriculum. And there are a few other things, but yeah, beyond that, it's pretty easy to kind of like hang a shingle.
Great. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this educational philosophy,
Mhm.
learner-driven education, sort of trusting children to take charge of their learning, to hold each other accountable, because I know that's a big part of the Acton model. And really this idea that adults are stepping back and empowering young people. So tell us a little bit more about this model and why you found it so attractive.
Yeah, I mean, I think the more I've been in it and the more I've been living it every day, like the greater my appreciation is for it. I mean, I see things where, okay, let's say there's a conflict between children, right? By stepping back, we allow the children to work out solutions. And they're incredibly capable of figuring out solutions to whether it's practical problems or interpersonal problems. They're pretty adept. And so, right, if we're intervening as adults, like we're really stealing that opportunity for them to develop those skills. And also, I think to develop that relationship because, right, I know from my adult relationships, when I've gone through a tough time with somebody, right, my relationship actually is usually deeper on the other side of that. So I think, that's one example of allowing children to sort out their own conflicts. We do have a conflict resolution process and a peace table, right? If things, um, if we need that. But I think that that builds a stronger community among the children. I also see, right, you mentioned how children hold each other accountable rather than guides. So there are two sides to that, right, where they're responsible for being servant leaders and contributing to the learning community. Um, I think the other piece of that is also holding like they start with a contract that they help write at the beginning of the year. And so they hold each other accountable to, keeping their promises to each other. So that contract really eliminates the need for like the nagging adult in the room. And children I see are much more responsive when it's their peers holding them accountable than when it's, us adults holding them accountable. So I find it like just a much more powerful force in building community and kind of starting to figure out what's right and wrong and understanding what are the consequences to their peers of their actions. So those are like a couple of maybe like more detailed examples. Um, yeah, are there other things kind of off of that
So
you'd want to talk about?
yeah, so what could you give an example of what sort of the students holding each other accountable? What would that look like in practice?
Yeah, what might that look like? Like maybe you're in maybe it's time for a Socratic discussion and everybody has come to the rug for that discussion. And there are a couple of children in the corner that are wrestling or not listening, or still talking. Like another hero in the discussion, like rather than the guide saying, "Oh, you guys, can you please listen?" Right? Another hero might say, hey guys, like we're trying to like we want to have the discussion. Could you either like sit up and listen and follow our rules of engagement, which are to listen with their whole body and eyes on the speaker, or would you like to take a break and go to the reset table and come back when you're ready? So like literally that would be how they might hold each other accountable.
I love that. And what is the sort of blend of academic kind of core content learning within the Acton model and these Socratic discussions, the more kind of project-based learning? How does that work on a typical week?
Sure. In terms of the Socratic discussions, it actually reminds me of a little bit of those like corporate training lectures I mentioned, where I said I would never lecture for 10 minutes before, right, participants are diving into an activity. And it's similar where guides are encouraged, like you have to keep it under 15 minutes and then you end with a challenge or an activity. And then, then they're off in terms of either it's core skills work or project work. So there are at least like 3 of those Socratic discussions a day. And they're usually used to launch the next activity. So there's a morning launch, right, that's focused on inspiring, equipping, or connecting. Um, and then they would go into core skills. So in our elementary studio, that looks like running partner teams meeting, setting either on a Monday, they would set their goals for the week, their core skills goal for the week, or they might just, if it's another day of the week, they would set their goal for that morning. So core skills last anywhere from like an hour and a half to 2 hours. And then there might be activities after that, like writer's workshop or DEAR, which is drop everything and read, which I will say, children having the opportunity to choose what they read, I've noticed is just a game changer in terms of their like joy and delight in reading. Then at our school, we would, at 11:45, we have lunch. And then we have like an hour of outdoor time after that. And a lot of our lunches, we take picnic lunches out on the patio. So they're outdoors for a good hour and a half. Then they come in, they have a quest launch, or it might be civilization. In civilization, it's really reading a story. We read from these books called The Story of the World. And then they may research kind of a Civ related question after that. So building those research skills, or Quest, which is really that hands-on project-based learning. And some of the quests that we've done, I mean, Acton has like the whole learning design full of them, but things like entomology was a particularly popular one, or Newton's physics of toys was a really popular one. E-ship is always popular. And then we tie that into our Acton Children's Business Fair that we host. Then after Quest, it's studio maintenance. So they're responsible for maintaining their own like studio and cleanliness and studio standards. And then it's what we call landing, right? So we start the day with a launch, and then we land it. And a lot of that's reflecting on the day.
I just love it. And the core skills piece is,
Mhm.
again, very learner led. You're leveraging, my understanding is you're leveraging, or learners
Mhm.
are leveraging technology tools, popular resources. Can you just share a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, in our elementary studio, they are, like you said, they're leveraging, Khan Academy. We've kept it pretty simple. I know there are some Actons that give their heroes more choices of platforms. I think as we grow, that's something we'll be able to do. But they're using, Khan Academy, Lexia, Grammaropolis, but they're also reading what we call badge books. Um, and we actually have like a separate shelf where we're starting to put books that are really designed for, say, first and second grade up through sixth grade. And a lot of it is like the Newbery Medal winners. Like we want them to be diving into, yeah, challenging books and also expanding their genres. So to get badge credit for one of those books, those are the two criteria. So they're also doing a ton of reading. One option that we're building in our school for core skills is our Spark Studio, which is the younger heroes ages 4 through 7. That's really Montessori based. And I've been getting my Montessori certification in both early childhood and lower elementary. So now, particularly, I find it particularly with math. Some of the elementary heroes can come do their core skills in the Spark Studio. And they really, because for some of them, they may not be ready for the more abstract math approach, right? So we have that option for them to continue exploring math with Montessori materials in a more concrete way.
Great. So I'm curious, Marissa, what you found the difference or the change from sort of when you first heard that podcast and heard about the philosophy of Acton Academy and learner-driven education to now seeing it in practice. What is
Mhm.
your sense of this educational model and how it empowers learners?
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess I can say, like, one of the biggest changes I think is, like, as a mom, I've let go a lot because I can trust that my son, and I see it with the other heroes as well, like, I can trust that as long as we're preserving their curiosity, and I think that that's what this model does, that they're hardwired to learn. So I saw it with my son. For example, I felt like in kindergarten as a parent, there was all this pressure that he should be reading, and a lot of chatter among parents like, "Oh, my child started reading when he or she was 3 and 4." And, meanwhile, my son had very little interest in reading. He loved being read too, but, yeah, so just over time, like I had to step back and say, I'm not going to force him to read. And then when he came to Acton and he had the choice, rather than reading the leveled readers, which he was getting at his former school, right? He started reading Dogman, Investigators. He was really fascinated with these like Nathan Hale books. Like his reading, like reading just exploded for him. So I think trusting, and I've seen other examples of that in him and the other children as well, that like trusting that when the interest is there, that the learning happens pretty quickly
And
when they're ready for it. Go ahead.
yeah, and you said that, he was coming home from the traditional schools that he was in, saying he didn't like school and he,
Mhm.
didn't want to be there. What has that change been like?
Oh my gosh. Literally, it was a couple of months ago. He said to me, because you'll never see him without a book. Like he always has a book in the back seat of the car. He always has a book in his backpack. We also like limit screens. So he has to read books. But he said to me the other day, he said, Mom, he's like, I got him some books for his birthday. And he said, Mom, I love books. Do you know why I love books? And I said, No, buddy, why do you love books? And he's like, Because I love reading. And he's like, Do you know why I love reading? And I was like, No, why do you love reading? He's like, Because I love learning. He's like, I want to learn forever. And so, like, just such, yeah, I mean, such a 180.
Oh, I love that story. So, what are you hearing from parents who are enrolling their kids in your school and you continue to grow? Why are they attracted to the Acton model?
Yeah, that's interesting because we did these, I think it was last fall, we did these videos, right? So we wanted to create these marketing videos and we interviewed some of the parents for those videos. And I think like one of the things that had appealed to me so much about the Acton model was the quests and the project-based learning. And it was fascinating because for so many parents, it's the self-paced core skills and having, their children having the ability to work at their own pace. And they notice that what happens is their children are actually become accelerated academically versus in other models. So I think, yeah, the self-paced learning, I think it's huge for a lot of parents. And it is appealing. Like we've had children join our school. Like we had a second grade boy who was just bored to tears at his old school, and he came here and he's so grateful because he always says like, I love the freedom and it's really challenging. Right? Like he's not bored here. But at the same time, like for any child, right, there's also the idea of eliminating those learning gaps, right? Like if you're at a school and a child is getting B's and C's, they're still being moved along with the rest of the class. But we don't move, right? A child here doesn't move along until they master a concept. So there are going to be some concepts that they fly through, others that might be more challenging, but they're not going to have gaps. So I think that is one of the things that really appeals to parents.
Great. And so tell us a little bit of what your future plans are for Acton Academy Madison West. I know many Acton Academies sort of grow with their students, eventually creating a launchpad studio, which is sort of the equivalent of a high school studio for young people getting ready for their next great adventure, as is often
Mhm.
used in the Acton vernacular. So what do you see as the future of your school?
Yeah, so, our goal is at the elementary school, which would include Spark, to have 75 to 100 students or heroes. We have a good deal of space where we are, so we feel like we can grow into it, and if we needed to, we could rent more space upstairs, so I feel like we're really fortunate that way. Um, yeah, and I'm starting to think about middle school because we have 2 heroes who, are 5th graders this year. We can go up to 6th grade, and then the question becomes, um, what kind of middle school option do we have for them? So that's definitely something on my mind in terms of eventually, we do wanna have a middle school and a launch pad. It's just a matter of when and how to do that. I know one thing that can be challenging that you hear other Acton owners, a lot of them will attest to this, is ideally you grow your middle school organically, right? Like you bring in the heroes who are accustomed to this model and they become the feeder to the middle school. And it can be challenging to bring in children from like a more conventional model into Acton at that older age. So I think that's something that, yeah, something I'm kind of grappling with right now in terms of what that middle school could look like. Like, could it be part-time homeschoolers? Should we stick with this more full-time private school model? I have heard of like there was through the grapevine of like a cohort of older Montessori children who kind of left in a wave. So could we like tap into that because I feel like they're going to be a little more learner driven and a good fit for the model. So yeah, that's kind of a nut that we have to crack in terms of the timing and challenges of that.
But you feel like the demand is there, Marissa, it sounds like, for growth, to be getting up into dozens of learners over what period of time would you say?
Yeah, so I guess that was a year and a half that we've gone from 4 to 15. I'm actually glad you're so bullish on that because I always feel like, gosh, we should be, on the one hand, right, there's always that trade-off between growth and operations, right? So I've always told parents we're going to grow smart, not fast, because there's so much that we've learned operationally over that last year and a half, so that we're not sacrificing quality. And it's a lot easier to retain families than it is to go find new families. So we're very focused on like nurturing what we have. I do feel like now, like I mentioned, I feel like we have a really good team in place. We've learned a lot. And so I think we are ready. And also, I've been in the studios. So um, I think we're getting there where I can step out more and kind of, pound the pavement and grow and try and grow a little faster. Um, I forget what your original question was, but
Well, I mean, I guess how you had said you can have 75 students at some point.
yeah.
I was just curious when you thought that time horizon would be.
Yeah, I mean, I think of that as kind of a like 4 maybe from now, maybe 3 to 4 more years.
Wow.
Yeah. I've
And then
also
that,
I've also I've also heard from some owners that in year 3, things really take off.
wow. And at that point too, presumably you'll be financially sustainable, able to take a salary. I mean, I think that's another thing that we try to talk about on the podcast a lot is just
Mhm.
sort of, running a school is running a small business. And in order for it to be successful, it has to be financially sustainable. So it sounds like that's also sort of part of your plan going forward.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's what's really appealing. So, kind of talking about the economics of the business, one of the things that like the Acton network holds schools accountable for is the ratio of learners to adults. So if you're truly empowering the heroes, then you don't need as many adults on campus. And that's actually what one of the things that appealed to me about this model as well is, I would like to like, I don't wanna increase tuition every year. I want us to be affordable. Um, so I think that's one of our goals as well, but, economically, that's one of the appeals of this learner-driven model as well, is you don't need to hire a lot of support staff and people and, yeah.
So great. So, what advice, as we begin to wrap up, Marissa, what advice do you have for aspiring school founders, someone who's thinking about launching their own micro school or similar learning model? What would you say for them to think about as they get going?
Um, hmm, I think for me one of the biggest lessons was just keep going. Um, like, I feel like especially at the beginning, there were times where I said, "Okay, could we just shut this all down?" And then it was like, "No, just keep going. Like, you're committed. Just keep going and see what happens." And so I find maybe some of that is maybe some of the challenging part, at least for me, was like the uncertainty And there were times when this was like really hard. And I feel like we're in a good place now. I'm sure we'll get back to the hard again. But overall, it's just been incredibly rewarding to know that we're providing this alternative for children and families. Incredibly rewarding for my own family. It's been an incredible journey for, my husband and me as people. And I see like how my son is growing. Like he's just more willing to take on responsibility and solve problems on his own. And like fundamentally, we need more of that in our world, in our society. So I don't know, maybe just holding on to that greater vision and purpose, I think is really important.
Ah, such good advice and a good reminder that it can be difficult to be an entrepreneur, to be starting something new and um, being able to sort of work through those challenges and as you said, hold on to that grander vision can be really helpful. So
Absolutely.
if my listeners and viewers want to learn more about Acton Academy Madison West and connect with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
Sure. Our website is www.actonmadison.com. So ACTONMADISON.com. And you can also email me at info@actonmadison.com. And I would be thrilled to hear from any of your listeners.
Wonderful. Well, Marissa Palmer, best wishes on the continued success of your school. And thank you so much for being on the LiberatED podcast.
Kerry, thanks so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it and really enjoyed this. Thank you. And what you're doing is incredibly important.